Hey folks, you're very welcome back to another episode of the Meditations on Movement podcast. Today, we're going to be going in depth, or at least in depth as we can within sort of the time frame of this episode. We're going to go in depth into breathing, basically. For me, this has been a really important or an interesting area of research over the last few months. Obviously, it spans back further, but I'd say that I've kind of looked more closely at things over the last few weeks or a month or so. Um, the intent with this really is not to just go into everything with breath or breathing, breath work, whatever may we want to describe it in this episode, but we will go into a little bit more of the kind of concrete things that we know about breathing, and hopefully that will give you an idea of where we will go in future episodes. And I want to kind of tie it into even the episode that I was talking about last week, or some of the things that I was talking about in last week's episode. So to give you a bit of an introduction, for me anyway, I think like most people, when you hear about breath work, you kind of just assume that most people can breathe properly. We don't really question too much whether we're kind of breathing correctly or how much oxygen we're taking in, unless we have sort of an issue with breathing, something like asthma or something like that, where we would kind of say, okay, there's got to be something there. But I think for the vast majority of people, we kind of just push it off to some degree. We maybe put it down to our level of fitness rather than the actual specific mechanical nature that is breathing. Okay. I actually had asthma when I was younger, but I remember specifically being told by my mum that my breathing was really heavy, especially when I was sleeping and stuff like that. I imagine it's something that actually a lot of children and babies and stuff like that actually do experience when they're younger, but mine seemed to clear up. I think I could have been using inhalers. I'm not actually quite sure. But I don't think I needed to use them for any sort of extended period into when I was sort of, playing lots of sports and running around a bit. I think that's potentially what cleared it up for me, which is very interesting, obviously. Um, I played a lot of field sports as well when I was younger, so I think that, you know, as you're sort of a kid, you're running about, you're playing, you're doing all these different things where you're moving about the body, and breathing is being affected. But that kind of continued into what would have been sort of later years into my teens and stuff like that, when I suppose it's interesting thinking back on it. You're suddenly so grateful for what you have done in your past, because you realize how much of a base it's given you. And for me in particular, it's given me such a good cardiovascular base. I've been in various lab testing and done like VO2 max tests, which is a way of kind of assessing a level of fitness, and achieved a very high score. And I kind of put that down to obviously the sports that I'd played. I'd never specifically focused, on running per se. So that's been sort of my base for a very young age. And I think that leads into, I suppose, what would have been my viewpoints about breathing, where I just wouldn't have seen it as a very important area, or wouldn't have put too much weight towards it. And this leads me then obviously to how I've now been pulled into breath work more in depth over the last little while. For me, it's been as a result of the more meditative practices that I've been involved in for, say, the past year and a half. Obviously, with the school, maybe a little bit beforehand, I was sort of pushing myself towards that direction. I've dipped my toe in and out of different meditative practices then prior to that period, but I'd say the more in-depth stuff, obviously everything to do with the movement school that I've just finished up with. So I would have always sort of seen the more performance and physiological side of breathing, and what it sort of would give you. And considering I was doing all of those different things, it maybe just didn't spark me the same way. I've kind of thought back to what would have been my injuries over the past few years. I didn't find myself really going in depth into those things until I had to deal with it really myself, spending a lot of time and really getting a grasp of what's going on. So that's sort of where I've been coming from over the past few years, definitely when it comes to breathing and breath work. So now that I've been um, involved in the more meditative practice side of things, it definitely sparked me to look into things a little bit more, and especially given the framework that I talked about last week, this idea of psyche, soma, and soul, we can certainly see how breath work will really spread out into all of these different areas. The impact that say various bits of breath work, we maybe think about it in some more of the traditional practices, how much of an impact they can have kind of on our awareness and that kind of bridge between psyche and spirituality. But then just in terms of the body itself, there's obviously something going on in a more physiological or biochemical perspective. And those are the things that maybe sort of ground us in our understanding of breath work. And hopefully where we're going to go a little bit today with the episode giving us that grounding as well. So the way I feel with this work is obviously I've been doing the practical side of things, and I can't point out how important it is that you get an idea of something from the more practical level, not necessarily first, but at some point. It's very often the case where we go into something and try to get a more theoretical understanding, which is obviously important. But until we sort of practically embody some of these things, I've talked about this concept before, where we really have to get an experiential feel for something until we realize its weight. You know, we can sit back and we can look at all the research and we can look at all these various things that are happening with breathwork, but we're just not going to be sort of stimulated by them, enthralled by them, really encapsulated by them until we go and do the work ourselves and see what that change really is to us internally. So that's something I'd really point out off the back end of this, and something, you know, this definitely leads into obviously stuff that I intend to do with the online community and with my students going forward, whether that be online or in person, is looking at these various things, the actual practices themselves, but also then giving sort of the background stuff so that we can have a nice entryway into this work. I think that's what kind of leads us towards what would be sort of the only way I can think of it is like the woo woo nature of some of the of breathwork strategies or breathwork in general. Certainly, it may be associated with more of the kind of mysticism and spirituality, where I can understand when people see that stuff first, they might roll their eyes, and they might just see it as like, right, you've just thrown me so deep into some line of work, and you haven't really given me a base to view this from, an understanding of what's actually going on more scientifically, which is something that we certainly want to see with any practice really, is we want to see some scientific grounding. But then I suppose we also have to recognize that just because there's no scientific data present doesn't mean that there can't be value in something. And potentially it's a case where it's just an early field. And that's certainly what you find a lot of breath work is. We can look at things and we can find sort of which I'm going to give you in a second, more of a physiological aspect or the biochemical aspect of what's going on here. We certainly shouldn't diminish what could possibly be like, knowledge that's been passed down from generation to generation through practical means, and that holds some value for sure. And just, we don't want to snuff at it and just say, oh yeah, like that's useless or something. There's clearly some value there. It's just, I feel that entry point for us really should be the kind of basic, what we know scientifically, what we know maybe mechanically, what's going on, to then give us a basis for how these perspectives or these opinions about breath work maybe developed and evolved over time. I just want to make sure I'm kind of covering things. I have notes of like what I want to go through here for this episode, and I think I've covered everything I've sort of intended on with that little brief introduction. Yeah, and certainly, as I said there, with more the kind of older traditions of breathing, I certainly wouldn't say I'm saying that they're bad or they're useless. It's certainly something that I am in the process now of looking at some of these traditions, looking at the practices and everything like that, and looking to discover where the value is and how they came about it. I often think this it as an interesting thing where, we obviously live in a culture where science is such a highly regarded thing. The rational mind as well is such a highly regarded aspect of Western culture. So where are we potentially rolling our eyes or not seeing the value in something that has been just passed down from generation to generation, that would be seen as sort of ancient knowledge? Like, I think of, say, like the vast libraries and documents over the years that would have been burned and thrown out when villages were raided and various wars were going on and stuff like that, where knowledge was just lost for eternity, that could have been built up over many years from tradition to tradition, where there's clearly some value, where we identify trends, and that was early forms of scientific data, you could argue, in some way, where there was something happening, whether it was internal or external. Something was happening, they were following a line of thought. Maybe it wouldn't be as rigorous as we have sort of science today, but there's potentially things that could have been lost, ways and means of going about breath work or various other things. So we certainly want to keep an open mind to these things, but then we have this sort of backing of the early research, or the basic research that we have on sort of breath work to, as I say, ground us going forward. So what I want to cover, more specifically then in terms of breathing, just for today, and this is to give you a little bit of an insight into where I'm going with sort of the educational material that I'm going to be giving towards to my students. The plan is to give this as integrative stuff that goes in line with, say, some of the training protocols that we're doing. As I said, I want the practical knowledge to be there, the practical means by which we sort of play around with these various things, actively doing something but understanding the theory behind it, so kind of the blend of those two together, into sort of the training sessions that we play around with, or the physical practice that we do. So what I want to give you today then is, back to what I was saying there about that, how that will sort of work, is the educational content will be given the practical work, and in some way this episode is to give you just a little bit of an insight into the way in which we might go about it. There'll be sort of more in-depth videos. This podcast is obviously a lot more, how would you say it? What would be the term? A lot more relaxed of an environment, whereas I want certainly the videos to be very, very direct and dense in terms of the information that's being put across. This is something that you could play in while you're training. This is something that you could play while you're doing a bit of housework or something like that. Whereas clearly, educational material of the type that I'm going to be giving across to my students needs to be the type of stuff they need to pay attention in that format. Lots of visuals, lots of explanations, more in depth, and so that we're really soaking up as much of it as possible, giving our full attention in some way. I can completely understand why someone might not be giving their full attention to this right now. So that's really the way in which I'm planning on giving it, and teaching it, so that it's in there with the practice, but then it would potentially be available as something, as kind of an aside to the physical practice that we're doing. Not just the training session itself, but additional material that can go and you can learn and access yourself through kind of like a library format. So, considering we're looking at what we know sort of scientifically and physiologically first as our focus, we are going to look first at what would be considered like the structure of the lungs and the actual mechanics of breathing. So if we think of the actual physiology, then we obviously have our lungs, and then we have the entranceways into the lungs. So we have the nasal passages, which is a really, really important part of breathing. It has some various things that it does, something I'll actually cover in a future episode. I don't really want to go into it today just because of the actual importance of it. I want to treat it as sort of a separate manner. But basically we have two entranceways of either the mouth or the nasal passages, and they lead to what is the trachea, which kind of sits side by side with the esophagus, food and water. Trachea is going to be how we take in air. Okay, we then have sort of like a tree-like structure in terms of the way they split. Trachea goes down and splits into the two sides of the lungs. If you've ever seen a diagram of the lungs, those two kind of you'll see there's two main bits to it, and you have basically the bronchioles that sort of split into it, and they go down into kind of secondary, tertiary bronchioles, kind of like branches of a tree. They get kind of smaller and smaller, branching out, and then they go into what are called the alveoli, and these are kind of sac-like structures. They just kind of increase what would be the surface area, so that all the capillaries can get in nice and close, and you can see that exchange of gas that needs to happen while we're breathing. Mechanically then, how we sort of actually draw the air in and out is down to pressure changes, and the pressure changes come by contraction and relaxation of various different muscles, the main ones being the diaphragm, and then you have kind of the intercostals of the ribs. So you can kind of think of the ribs as like that forward and backward motion. We can all kind of think, if we place our hand on our chest, we take a breath in, we can feel that kind of pushing outward of the ribs. And basically that's what the intercostals are doing. They are contracting in order to sort of open up the ribs and expand and take air in, along with the diaphragm, which kind of sits like a dome-like structure. If you were to kind of chop yourself in half, you would see the diaphragm kind of going across the body, and as I said, sort of a dome-like structure, like an igloo. When it contracts, it kind of presses down, and then when it relaxes, it pushes back up. So this leads to kind of that pressure change that we're seeing when we inhale and we exhale. We can think, as we inhale, we can see what would be the diaphragm kind of contracting down and flattening, so turning from kind of an igloo shape and then flattening down. And if you imagine what's happening from a pressure perspective, if we think of what's happening, it's that air is being drawn in by that contraction. You have like the opening of what would be the mouth and the nasal passages, and air will be drawn in as we contract the diaphragm, and that sort of flattens down. The pressuring is drawing air in, that pressure change. The same to do with the intercostals. They're expanding, so it's kind of like almost like a full 360 degree expansion, where the change in pressure means that air is going to be drawn into the chest cavity and into the lungs. It's going to fill up the bronchioles, the alveoli, and you're going to get lots of air in, and then you'll see that relaxation where everything sort of compresses back in, and you'll see the pressure change again causes air to actually be pushed out. Okay, so that's an important thing to sort of understand then when it comes to the mechanics of breathing, and to kind of go about what is, okay, once we get an understanding of that, once again, we can kind of get a better basis of, okay, if we have, say, what would be considered like a dysfunctional breathing, issues with our breathing, we can understand how, if we have issues to do with, say, the diaphragm or the ribs, we're going to find it hard to draw air in. Okay, so you're going to find issues with, say, if there's an inability to relax the diaphragm or even contract it in some way, your breathing is going to be impaired. You're not going to be inhaling and getting as much oxygen into the body. And there's various ways in which we can sort of train the body or get better at doing that, if that is the issue. Of course, I would say certainly there's going to be some value in most people having a go at it, but if you're someone who is, say, not got issues around the sort of physiology there, those specifically to do with, say, like the actual mechanics of breathing, then it's maybe not going to give you as much value, because you've already got it kind of installed within the body. So certainly consider that as something going forward. While it might seem obvious, or while it might seem not relevant to you, you can understand its relevancy across the board if someone does have issues with those things I just covered there, in terms of the mechanics of breathing, the lungs, the diaphragm more specifically, and the intercostals. From a biochemical standpoint, this is another important area that I want to cover. So we've kind of discussed there what is like the structure of the lungs, the mechanics of breathing, how we're actually drawing that air in. So what's actually going on with the air that is being brought in during the inhalation and exhalation process, what's going on biochemically, that in terms of the transfer and gas exchange that's going on. So we would have heard this before probably, where we're told that we inhale O2, or oxygen, and we exhale CO2 or carbon dioxide. Okay, probably most people have heard that to some degree, but let's sort of look at it in more detail. What's the importance and what's the relevancy there, and what's really happening? So, basically, we have to get an understanding of oxygen is required by our respiring cells. Our cells are going about various processes, and they require oxygen to help with those processes, basically. They then give off extra carbon atoms as sort of a waste product of those various processes. So they're taking in oxygen and they're getting rid of excess carbon. And this comes down to, I suppose, what is the chemical formula of those two, of carbon dioxide and oxygen. We've got O2 and CO2. So O2 is just kind of two oxygen molecules, like O2 being two of them, and then carbon dioxide is CO2. So it's just a carbon attached to those two molecules, basically. So that's sort of the difference. It's just a kind of an extra carbon that is released as a result of those respiring cells in the body. Okay. An important thing to kind of cover here, or to point out, basically, is that while we say we inhale O2 and we exhale CO2, it's not that, we take in and extract all the oxygen from the air that we've just inhaled. We take in some of it. We basically change what is the percentages difference in the air. I think varying levels of oxygen, I can't remember specifically, but it's somewhere in the region of sort of 16%. So we're inhaling that whatever percentage it is, I think it's 16. And we're exhaling out a certain percentage, a lower percentage, because we've actually taken some of it in. But basically, we've just changed about the percentage. We would have taken in a certain amount of CO2, and we're just exhaling and getting rid of CO2 from the body. So we just see the sort of chemical changes in our O2 and CO2 in our breath change, basically. Okay? So in some way, we try to think of it as we don't actually utilize all the oxygen that we take in our breath. Okay, and this is an important thing to establish, because we will be looking at something called the Bohr effect, which is important to do with that sort of gas exchange. It's basically the way in which oxygen is released from the hemoglobin of the blood. Hemoglobin is where the CO2 and O2 are transported. So if we go back to the mechanism of breathing, we were talking about the lungs, the trachea, the bronchioles, the alveoli. We're taking in our inhalation, we're bringing in a certain level of oxygen in that inhaled air. And when it gets all the way towards the alveoli, there is basically, as I said, they're these kind of little sac-like structures. They have lots of capillary networks, interweaved in between them, so that it's really easy for blood to get nice and close, and for oxygen and CO2 to pass the cell walls and stuff like that. So you get this offloading of excess CO2 from the blood into the alveoli, and then you get that another exchange of oxygen in from the alveoli into the blood. Okay, and hemoglobin basically is that little transport molecule. It attaches to the hemoglobin. The important thing to kind of point out then with hemoglobin is that it has a higher affinity for CO2, so it's actually going to readily offload oxygen into the cells that need it. And this is a really important point, because it's the cells need oxygen. As we said, they're going about lots of different processes, and they need oxygen as a result. So the fact that hemoglobin has a high affinity towards CO2 means that it's just going to easily offload the oxygen into the respiring cells when it's necessary, when that change sort of happens. Okay. You might then be wondering, okay, so how, if that's the sort of process that's happening, how are we sort of monitoring this in some way? And basically what we have in the body are various different chemoreceptors of the respiratory system, that are going to monitor both oxygen levels and carbon dioxide levels. One way to think of what are considered chemoreceptors is obviously they're sending signals to the brain in terms of the levels of these various things. It's kind of like a thermostat, that regulates the temperature in a household. But in our body, basically in the respiratory system, it is regulating what is the concentrations of carbon dioxide and oxygen in your blood, along with what would be like the acidity and pH levels, which are kind of impacting basically as well the breathing rate as well. Okay, so what we would say then is when levels of carbon dioxide increase above a certain amount, your brain is monitoring the levels. It's getting various information from the chemoreceptors, and it's monitoring the levels in the blood, and it's seeing, okay, if the receptors notice that increase in carbon dioxide, these receptors will stimulate breathing in order to get rid of the excess gas in the blood, and basically try to bring in more oxygen. Okay. So what we're saying here is that the primary stimulus to breathe is actually to eliminate excess carbon dioxide from the body. And this is the important thing that I'm trying to kind of cover here, is that it's not necessarily the oxygen levels that are influencing how we breathe. It's actually the carbon dioxide levels in our blood that's impacting or influencing our breathing rate. So we're trying to offload that excess carbon dioxide, and as a result, bring in more oxygen. And you see this basically down to like what would be considered the carbon dioxide sensitivity of the body. Some people can be very sensitive to carbon dioxide, and it's almost as if it reaches a certain tolerance and the body tries to breathe in more and more, whereas for others they're going to have a higher set point, and it means that they're sort of aware that their tolerance is okay, there's no real issue, and they're going to keep their breathing at a much lower rate. So it's interesting to sort of note back to what we were saying earlier, how various practical drills are going to influence our breathing rate. The important thing I suppose to point out with carbon dioxide, in the blood, is that having loads of carbon dioxide isn't really going to be too detrimental. It's the basic thing of the sensitivity. If the body has adapted in some way to be really, really sensitive to it, that's where you see those massive differences in sort of breathing rate. But having excess carbon dioxide in the blood isn't going to be too detrimental, is the way to think of it. There are actually some positive impacts of carbon dioxide. It can actually dilate blood vessels a little bit more and allow kind of more of a free flow of oxygen throughout the body. So that's what we're sort of saying here. And then when we bring it back to sort of the practical things, we can see now how we breathe, or the way we breathe, can actually influence these subtle changes in carbon dioxide and oxygen in the blood and body. So we have what would be considered the physiological aspect of doing things to help the diaphragm function better as it contracts and relaxes along with the intercostals. Then we also have things like, say, breath holds, different durations of say, inhalations and exhalations that are also going to impact our body and our bloodstream on a chemical level. So with that introduction there of what is, as I said, the physiology, the biochemistry of what's going on, we can see how these changes, and this is something I'm going to go into in a future episode. I don't want to be too sort of information heavy on this episode. There's a lot to sort of digest there, and I can understand it's something that sort of gets me as well, is the differences in oxygen and carbon dioxide that can mess with us a little bit, and it's something that we have to take our time to understand, is how it's actually the carbon dioxide levels in the body that are going to influence our breathing rather than the oxygen levels. So this will certainly impact, or will lead us to future episodes going into certain things. There's tons and tons of different traditions, as I said, that will almost be considered more advanced material. There's no point in going into them sort of straight away when there's lots to be done in terms of, say, just basic things of playing around with breath holds, inhalations, exhalations. um, the improving what would be, say, the physiological structure of the intercostals, the diaphragm. And it's interesting as well seeing how you can have a certain play on what is the um, response of the nervous system in terms of your breathing as well. It's very, very well established now that, you know, the an exhalation is associated with more of a parasympathetic response from the nervous system, kind of like a calming effect. You see this with, I've certainly seen this in terms of, say, the effect of breathing on stretching or relaxing a muscle. You will see it where people go into these big breath holds, or their breathing becomes really, really hard and heavy when they get into a position that is considered like a stretch or is uncomfortable. When obviously we want sort of a relaxing impact, we don't want to hold on to too much tension because we're trying to open up range of motion. So we're trying to focus on our breathing. We're trying to go for long, slow exhales, and we feel that in terms of what it does to our physiology and what it does to our nervous system. We see that sort of calming effect that happens as a result of a long and slow, prolonged exhale. Whereas the idea of, say, like hyperventilating, bringing in more air in a really fast manner, has been associated with various different things as well. It's been associated with, hyperventilation, like bringing along, say, panic attacks, just really, really aggressively increasing air intake, and also with, say, various different forms, the more advanced things, obviously, that I've talked about, where we're looking at different traditions like tumo breathing, where you're really increasing the internal heat of the body. This is something kind of the Wim Hof method has been inspired by, or has taken influence from the tradition of tumo breathing. So we can see how this basis here now of having what is the mechanical structure and the biochemical structure of what's going on during breathing now pans out into, okay, well, what do these various things now have how do they have an effect on us with, say, working on various lengths of inhalations, exhalations, breath holds, the structure itself, increasing what is the volume of air that we take in over a period of time, or the how many breaths we take in, or whether it's really shallow breathing, really heavy breathing, all that sort of stuff. So many different branches from here, but at least now we have that base of what we're thinking about with breathing. Okay. And as I said, for me, this is obviously an interesting area that I'm finding myself looking into a lot more, but I'm also making sure that I'm playing around with the more practical side of things too. So I'm trying out these various breathing patterns, these various protocols, and seeing what they do to me. You know, I have a regular practice now where I do what would be considered maybe more breathwork style stuff, and also more kind of like meditative practices too. And I'm seeing these changes as well, which are very, very interesting. I don't have anything like a blood oximeter yet, because I haven't been playing around with things where I've been trying to change too much the oxygen and carbon dioxide levels of the blood too much. You know, it's not necessarily for me to track just yet, but maybe something I'll look into in the future when I'm playing around with some of those specific protocols. But yeah, very, very, very interesting in terms of my own research and what I'm doing, and something that I'm certainly looking to teach on to students, integrating it in, starting at a very basic level, making sure that we have these sort of various protocols understood, and then advancing into more sort of, we've said there that idea of maybe looking at it more from the somatic perspective and looking at the body and seeing what it does, and then looking towards maybe the psyche and sort of integrating that in, but then also the soul part of it too. Various practices have obviously been, breathing practices, yoga, the idea of prana as well. Those sort of systems, they're obviously interlinked and tied within meditative practices. So what is it doing there too? And that's where I'm hoping to go with a lot of this stuff myself. So I'll see how to sort of integrate this in with the podcast, but then obviously more specifically, it's the work with my students where I'm going to see most of this kind of concrete stuff to communicate, where I'm going to communicate that stuff. Okay, so hopefully this episode has been very interesting for you. I know it's been something. Once again, it's the reason why I'm doing the podcast too, is to sort of help me get a better understanding of these things, how I'm communicating them, and just a different way to sort of play around with some of these things for myself. So I'm going to leave it at that for today. Hopefully this will maybe start like a little bit of a series on breathing too. So we've looked at some various things there. I said earlier on the importance of nasal breathing. There's lots of interesting stuff to that in terms of the reasons why we might do it and history of it. So maybe a future episode, and we can just chip away bit by bit on some things on breathing, some things that I found interesting, or some various protocols or something like that to give you guys a little bit of taste of what I'm doing with my students. Okay, but for the moment, thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you soon.